The Venezuelan cartel never expected the storm that came for them. In a sudden and precise strike, a U.S. Navy destroyer obliterated a cartel drug boat in the Caribbean, sending fire and wreckage into the sea. The operation was a warning shot to every network feeding America's drug crisis. It showcased U.S. naval dominance and Washington's resolve to crush the cartels at their source. But one question now lingers. How far is Donald Trump willing to go in this escalating war on narcotics? And could these bold actions trigger broader tensions on the international stage? Join us as we explore the details of how a Venezuelan cartel drug boat got wiped off after a lethal strike. The dark waters of the Caribbean have long been a stage for smugglers and traffickers. But in recent years, the United States military has turned this stretch of ocean into a battleground, striking at what it describes as violent cartels operating out of Venezuela. Two deadly encounters in September painted a picture of how Washington is willing to project power far beyond its shores to protect its people. The first strike occurred on the second day of September. A small vessel left San Juan de Unare, a fishing town along Venezuela's Sucre coast. Its intended destination was the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, just a short ride away. But according to U.S. intelligence, this was no innocent fishing trip. The boat carried members of the criminal group known as Tren de Aragua, one of South America's fastest-growing gangs, feared for its brutal methods and its control of smuggling routes. American surveillance tracked the vessel as it entered international waters in the southern Caribbean. When U.S. forces moved in, the encounter ended with the boat in flames. 11 suspected cartel members were killed in the operation. A White House video later confirmed the fiery aftermath, showing just how far the U.S. military was prepared to go to stop what it called narco-terrorists. Less than 2 weeks later, a second incident raised tensions even higher. On the 15th day of September, another Venezuelan vessel was destroyed at sea. This time, 3 men on board were killed. President Donald Trump announced the action on his Truth Social account, labeling the suspects as narco-terrorists who were transporting illegal drugs toward the United States. He described the attack as a kinetic strike. In military terminology, this refers to the use of weapons that physically impact a target, such as missiles, bombs, or gunfire, as opposed to cyber or electronic methods. The president's statement was blunt. He declared that these boats were not just carrying narcotics, but a deadly poison that was harming American citizens. His message underlined the administration's view that drug cartels should be treated as serious national security threats rather than simple criminals. For the U.S. lawmakers, however, the strikes triggered debate. Both Republicans and Democrats questioned whether the military should be carrying out lethal attacks in international waters without broader discussion in Congress. Critics worried about the precedent. Could the fight against drugs now be waged like a war, with targeted killings far from U.S. soil? However, questions about the repercussions of these actions were just the beginning. Reports from Washington suggested that frustration had grown among officials. They reportedly believed that the strikes had not altered Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's position. Instead, the backlash seemed stronger inside the United States, where questions over legality and wisdom had slowed momentum for further steps. Maduro, on his side, was said to have consistently rejected allegations of drug trafficking, describing the U.S. operations as part of an imperial effort to overthrow his government. Yet he was also reported to have sent a letter in which he expressed his willingness to open direct talks with Washington. In the letter, he was said to have credited Special Envoy Richard Grenell with helping clear earlier disputes, including disagreements over migrant deportations. The letter, dated September 6th, only days after the first boat strike, reportedly urged Trump to work with him to defeat the falsehoods that damage relations, which he described as needing to be historic and peaceful. Analysts noted that it was uncertain whether the offer represented genuine flexibility or a tactic to buy time. Meanwhile, Trump was reported to have continued with fiery language. On his Truth Social account, he was said to have demanded that Venezuela accept deported prisoners and individuals from psychiatric institutions, referring to them as monsters. He warned Caracas that the price for refusal would be incalculable. Human rights advocates and regional experts were described as deeply alarmed. Kenneth Roth, the former director of Human Rights Watch, was reported to have argued that ordering further killings did not make them more legal, labeling the actions summary executions rather than genuine acts of war. But Kenneth wasn't the only one that saw these strikes as deeply disturbing. Carlos Soler, a researcher with the Royal United Services Institute, was quoted as warning that unilateral U.S. military action could provoke widespread consequences throughout Latin America, where fragile politics and tense regional dynamics made such intervention especially risky. Commentators concluded that the issue had grown far larger than narcotics. They suggested that the debate was now centered on sovereignty, international law, and the potential dangers of a new conflict brewing in the Western Hemisphere. Still, for supporters, the message was clear. These strikes showed American resolve in the face of criminal groups that have become transnational players. The Tren de Aragua gang, for example, began in Venezuelan prisons but has since spread across Latin America, building networks in Colombia, Peru, Chile, and beyond. By hitting them on the high seas, Washington was sending a warning that no smuggling route was safe. The symbolism of these actions cannot be ignored. The Caribbean has always been a highway for both commerce and crime. During the Cold War, it was a chessboard for superpower rivalry. Today, it has become the front line in the fight against narcotics trafficking. By launching direct military strikes, the United States is reviving a tradition of using naval power to keep order on the seas. Undeterred by what the consequences of these actions might be, the United States Navy has continued to keep a strong presence in the Caribbean through the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, which operates under U.S. Southern Command. This task force is built for power, flexibility, and rapid response. At its core is the USS Iwo Jima, a massive amphibious assault ship capable of launching helicopters, aircraft, and landing craft for missions at sea or ashore. Alongside it are the USS San Antonio and USS Fort Lauderdale, both amphibious transport dock ships designed to carry Marines, vehicles, and equipment into action. The ARG is not just about ships, it's about people. Around 4,500 sailors operate and maintain the vessels, while 2,200 Marines of the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit stand ready for combat, humanitarian missions, or crisis response. Together, they form a floating base of strength that can adapt to nearly any mission in the region. From disaster relief to counter-narcotics operations and deterrence against hostile actors, the Iwo Jima ARG exemplifies American power projection in the Latin American region. Its presence in the Caribbean reminds allies and rivals alike that the U.S. can respond quickly, decisively, and with overwhelming force whenever required. However, that's not all President Trump has in store for the war against narcotics. However, Donald Trump has proven that he's not one to relent in the face of consequences. In fact, what started as a lethal strike in the Caribbean might grow into something even more deadly. According to reports, the United States may be closer than ever to taking direct action inside Venezuela. A newly renamed Department of War has been secretly drafting plans for strikes on alleged drug traffickers, with some sources suggesting attacks could launch within weeks. 4 insiders, 2 U.S. officials familiar with the blueprints, and 2 others aware of the high-level discussions, have confirmed the existence of these plans. Behind the scenes, officials revealed that Trump had not yet given his final approval, but they believed he was prepared to use every element of American power if needed. These future actions could include drone operations aimed at alleged traffickers, their leaders, and suspected drug processing facilities inside Venezuela. The possibility itself, they noted, revealed how far the administration was willing to go in its maximum pressure campaign. However, if the strikes actually happen, it would mark a dramatic escalation between Washington and Caracas. Officials that are very close to the matter believe that President Nicolas Maduro had failed to act strongly enough against the narcotics trade passing through his country. This, they explained, was one of the key reasons behind the push for more aggressive measures. At the same time, quieter channels of diplomacy appeared to be opening. According to a senior administration official, Middle Eastern leaders were acting as intermediaries between the U.S. and Venezuela. Maduro had spoken with these mediators and suggested he might be willing to make certain concessions if it helped him hold on to power. Lawmakers have also expressed alarm. Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, a member of the Armed Services Committee, said she was deeply disturbed by reports of multiple strikes carried out without congressional authorization. She accused the administration of bragging about killings and promising more to come while ignoring constitutional limits. Senators Tim Kaine and others later wrote to the White House, demanding answers about the legality and justification of the attacks. Even those who managed to attend classified briefings left with more questions than answers. Observers noted that the Department of War had failed to provide a legal expert during the sessions, leaving staff without clarity on whether the killings were lawful. Briefers hinted that further lethal operations were planned, suggesting the campaign was not a one-off action, but part of a broader strategy. Legal experts outside the government weighed in with scathing criticism. Sarah Harrison, formerly a Pentagon advisor on human rights, argued that framing the boat strikes as acts of war was misleading. She stated that there had been no armed attack on the United States, no armed conflict with Venezuela, and no justification for lethal force. To her, the strike amounted to premeditated murder of civilians, not a legitimate act of war. She added that under both domestic and international law, the killings were illegal, since there had been no imminent threat to U.S. lives. Sarah Yeager, a former senior advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and now at Human Rights Watch, echoed the concern. She warned that the president appeared to believe he could kill anyone under any circumstances without accountability, a stance she said threatened the rule of law. Meanwhile, reports suggested that Special Operations Command had carried out the strikes, though the Pentagon refused to confirm. Senator Rand Paul claimed drones had been used, reinforcing suspicions that the U.S. military was relying on unmanned aircraft for targeted killings in the Caribbean. The controversy deepened when Venezuelan officials accused U.S. forces of boarding a tuna boat in their waters. Foreign Minister Yvonne Gill claimed that 18 armed personnel from a U.S. Navy destroyer had illegally occupied the vessel for 8 hours before releasing 9 fishermen. Washington offered no clear explanation of how such an operation advanced American security. The backdrop to these events was a larger accusation that Trump's administration was reviving regime change efforts against Nicolas Maduro. Venezuelan officials pointed out that Maduro and his allies had been indicted in U.S. courts years earlier, and that rewards for his capture had recently been doubled to $50 million. The Trump team also placed the so-called Cartel of the Suns, allegedly tied to Maduro's circle, on a list of designated terrorist organizations. A secret directive reportedly ordered the Pentagon to treat certain Latin American cartels as targets for military action. To critics, the pattern was unmistakable. They argued that under the guise of counter-narcotics, Washington was edging toward undeclared war, bypassing Congress, and normalizing extrajudicial killings. Supporters, however, insisted that decisive force was the only way to disrupt trafficking networks that continued to funnel deadly drugs into the United States. As accusations of murder clashed with justifications of national security, another shocking allegation has been brought to light. It emerged that the War Department had concealed very important details about the lethal operation that killed 11 men at sea. Reports have indicated that the vessel had changed course and appeared to head back to shore before being struck. Survivors of an initial blast were said to have been killed in a follow-up attack. Critics argued that the incident went far beyond what had been disclosed publicly. The officials, speaking anonymously because of the sensitivity of the matter, explained that the military repeatedly struck the vessel until it sank. President Trump later stated that he had personally authorized the attack, alleging the boat carried drugs. Yet critics pointed out that no hard evidence had been produced, only Trump's claim that recordings existed of the men speaking. The operation marked a dramatic shift from the traditional law enforcement approach to suspected smuggling vessels. Rather than attempting interdiction, the administration had chosen outright destruction. To many legal observers, that choice looked less like defense and more like execution. The Trump administration advanced an unusual legal argument. It suggested that using lethal military force against drug smugglers was justified under the laws of armed conflict. The reasoning, according to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others, was that drug trafficking created an immediate national security threat, with more than 100,000 American deaths from overdoses each year. Trump repeated this point in a letter to Congress, framing the strike as self-defense. But the justification was swiftly dismissed by many legal experts, including former senior military lawyers. They argued that the law did not permit a president to equate suspected drug smuggling with an imminent armed attack on the United States. Even if such an interpretation were accepted for argument's sake, they noted, the fact that the boat appeared to turn away from U.S. territory further weakened the self-defense claim. Retired legal advisors emphasized that under international law, the use of force must be proportional and necessary to confront an actual threat. In this case, they pointed out, the alleged smugglers were low-level suspects who had not fired on American forces. To treat them as wartime combatants, they said, amounted to rewriting long-standing legal norms. The disclosures underscored how far the administration was willing to stretch both domestic and international law to justify military action. By invoking the laws of war, critics argued, the White House blurred the lines between policing and warfare. They warned that normalizing such actions risked setting dangerous precedents, allowing future presidents to target individuals far from any battlefield under the guise of national defense. Human rights advocates noted that summary killings of this kind had historically been considered unlawful. To them, the administration's reasoning seemed less like a legal framework and more like an attempt to cover an extrajudicial execution with a veneer of legitimacy. Even among those who accepted that drug trafficking was a major crisis, doubts persisted. If the aim had been to protect American lives, they asked, why destroy the boat instead of interdicting it and arresting those aboard? Critics suggested that a choice had been made to demonstrate power rather than to enforce the law. Meanwhile, legal experts outside the government described the situation in stark terms. Sarah Harrison, a former Pentagon advisor on human rights, argued that calling the strike an act of war was misleading. In her view, there had been no attack on the U.S., no conflict with Venezuela, and no legal basis for the use of force. She described the killings as premeditated murder of civilians who had posed no imminent threat. Further controversy followed when Secretary of State Marco Rubio remarked that U.S. forces could have intercepted the boat and arrested its crew, but instead chose to destroy it. To Harrison, that admission removed any claim that the killings were necessary. She pointed out that under U.S. military law, federal statutes, and international human rights standards, civilians could not lawfully be executed. At the same time, U.S. military deployments surged in the region. F-35 stealth fighters landed in Puerto Rico, joining thousands of Marine, sailors, and warships in one of the largest buildups in years. Drones were spotted at Coast Guard bases, and the Pentagon accelerated work to reopen a naval station long closed. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, visiting the USS Iwo Jima, told troops that their mission was not training, but a real-world campaign to protect America from poisoning. On television, he refused to rule out regime change. Jacobs, however, feared the opening moves of another endless war. She warned that America's youngest generations could be left paying the price in lives and tax dollars if Congress failed to step in. The revelations left open troubling questions. Had the administration deliberately expanded the definition of self-defense beyond recognition? And what did that mean for the future use of military force? For many, the image of a boat turning back, only to be struck repeatedly, became a symbol of how blurred the boundaries between war and policing had become. It shows a consequential effort to make a point and strike fear in the head of not just cartel members, but civilians who might be wrongfully identified as cartel members. Many observers have consistently warned that Donald Trump's hardline approach to eliminating drugs in the United States might do more harm than good. By focusing heavily on militarized tactics, harsher penalties, and extreme deterrence, critics argued his strategy risked overlooking the root causes of addiction, such as poverty, mental health, and lack of treatment access. Some experts cautioned that such measures could swell prisons, strain foreign relations, and push drug activity deeper underground, making the crisis harder to solve instead of bringing lasting relief. Thanks for watching. Before you go, click the link on your screen to check out another video. See you there.